Today I'm reviewing a Henley sweater with an epaulette shoulder construction. Materials used for knitting. Knitting needles, size 2 mm. Knitting needles, size 3 mm. With a 1 meter cable. Yarn, Alice, Rio, 430 meters per 100 grams, or similar yarn. Additional knitting needles, waste yarn, tapestry needle, stick markers, row counter, crochet hook. The sweater is knit from the bottom up. The sleeves were wet blocked during the process. To determine their length, the pieces are knit in round, without seams. After all, parts of the sweater were knitted. Up to the armhole, to the raglan line. Additional stitches were placed on waste yarn for the underarm. The knitting then continued in the round. Then, in short rows, because a center front placket was planned with a button closure. I'll also talk separately about the underarm stitches and the sweater placket. I explain in detail. For the half brioche rib, which forms the base of the sweater, an odd number of stitches is required. For example, for size S, 115 stitches on the front and 115 on the back, a total of 230 stitches. The sleeves require an even number of stitches, with increases of 2 stitches every 10 rows. After the underarm stitches were placed on waste yarn, raglan lines were formed, with decreases worked on both sides. Seven stitches were allocated to each raglan line. 7 stitches were also allocated to the center front plank. Along the fronts and the back, a total of 10 stitches are decreased on each side. Along the sleeve, stitches are decreased to form the epaulette shoulder. At the same time, the placket is worked in hollow rib. using the main needles. Size 3 millimeters. Adjusted according to knitting gauge. 1 row of hollow rib corresponds to 1 row of half pattern rib. The placket is worked following this principle. The first row is worked starting from the placket. Leave a long yarn tail at the beginning. Using a marker, I mark 7 stitches at the center. And then I continue knitting in this way. Starting from the first placket marker. The first stitch is a knit stitch. Then a yarn over onto an additional needle. The second stitch is knit. A yarn over onto the additional needle. Again, a knit stitch. Another yarn over onto the additional needle. Then again, a knit stitch, followed by a yarn over. Knit stitch, yarn over. The yarn over must be placed on the additional needle. Another knit stitch, yarn over. And so on until the end of the row. The last stitch is knit, and the final yarn over is placed on the additional needle. In total, there are 7 stitches and 7 yarn overs placed on the additional needle. Then another additional needle is introduced into the work. 7 stitches have already been cast onto it using waste yarn. Using the long yarn tail left at the beginning. It is also brought into the work. I knit the additional stitches from the waste yarn. I work them as purl stitches using the yarn tail left at the beginning. So this is my main working needle. Next, there are 2 auxiliary needles. At this point, the placket is already formed. There is also one additional needle, onto which I cast on yarn overs. I turn the work. Then I start forming a hollow placket from these stitches. This is my main working yarn. The first stitch is worked as a knit stitch. The second stitch, which is at the back, is slipped without knitting with the yarn held in front. The yarn is always kept in front of the stitch. Next one, knit stitch. I slip the next stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. 1 knit stitch. Slip the stitch without knitting. I do this so that all stitches are placed onto one needle. So that the auxiliary needle does not interfere with my work, as stitches could slip off it, and then it would take a long time to pick them up again. Everything starts from the beginning. At first glance, this may seem difficult, but with practice, it becomes very easy. I highly recommend practicing hollow placket knitting first. And this is the last stitch of the placket. I leave a marker to identify where the placket begins. And where the main pattern starts. Now only one auxiliary needle remains, which I am not going to use at the moment. I knit in the round. Next, I knit the row to the end. I have completed the purl row to the end, and I am left with one additional needle with yarn overs. I also still have this extra yarn that was used to cast on the stitches. Now, what I am going to do next? I will transfer these stitches onto the needle and remove the waste yarn, so that I am left with live stitches. Thus I have transferred all stitches onto the auxiliary needle. And now I will form the hollow placket. The first stitch is a knit stitch. I slip the second stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Again 1 knit stitch. The stitch from the second needle, which is at the back, I slip without knitting. Knit. I knit these stitches from the yarn overs that were placed on the auxiliary needle. At the beginning of knitting this placket, from the second needle, I slip 1 stitch purlwise. Thus all 7 stitches from one needle and the other. I transfer onto a single needle. As a result, I now have 14 stitches. And the final stitch. Now I can already show you the result. I turn the work and start knitting with the main needle. At the beginning of the row, the first stitch is knit. The second stitch is slipped purlwise, with the yarn in front. Then I knit the knit row to the end. All the way to the marker and to the end of the placket. I have reached the marker and continue knitting the hollow placket. I knit 1 stitch. Slip the next stitch purlwise. Then I continue following the same principle. The last stitch can be worked as a purl stitch. Then I turn the work. And now I no longer knit the first stitch, but slip it. The second stitch, which is at the back, is also slipped purl. All stitches at the front are knitted. The stitches at the back are left unworked on the needle. The yarn is held in front of the stitch. Knit 1, slip 1 yarn, in front, knit, slip, and then comes the marker. Then I knit the row to the end again. Up to the placket, which can also be marked with a marker. to clearly identify where the placket begins and where the main pattern starts. I knit up to the marker. Then I knit the placket to the end. I turn the work and continue knitting following the same principle. Once again, I reach the marker. For convenience, I switch to short needles. So that the cable does not get in the way. I knit one stitch, slip the next. The front stitch is knitted. The back stitch is slipped. This gives me 14 stitches. If at the end one stitch is missing, it can be worked from a yarn over. To maintain 14 stitches. Then I turn the work again and knit to the end. I have knitted up to the marker. After the marker, I knit the placket again. I slip a stitch, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, slip. The last stitch may be worked as a purl stitch, or if I leave it slipped, I make sure to knit it at the beginning of the next row. Here, I simply slip it purlwise. I also slip the next stitch purlwise. This yarn that we left at the beginning can later be cut and hidden inside the hollow placket. Then I continue knitting following the same principle. No additional turns of the work are required. One row of the placket corresponds to one row of half pattern stitch. Next, I can see that the hollow placket is complete. I slip the marker, and I start knitting the main half pattern ribbed placket. At this point I can see that the placket is already fully formed. I will knit a few more rows. After that, there will be a buttonhole. I will also demonstrate how to knit it. So I have already knitted several rows of the placket. I already really want to fasten it on the first button. I have even sewn it on already. And now, I am going to make the buttonhole. For this, I take one more marker and place the marker at the center of the placket. Usually I do not knit all the way to this point. Instead, I will make turns at this spot. At the center of the placket, if I have 7 stitches, to the center of the placket, the placket has 14 stitches in total. So I slip the first stitch and knit the second stitch. Since this is how the stitches are arranged, I work them following the hollow placket method. Then I knit to the turning point. I turn the work and knit again. At the same spot where the marker is, I do not knit all the way to the end. I turn exactly at the center, and I knit several rows this way. I make these turns 4 times. In order to form a buttonhole. The buttonhole will not be very large, because if it is too large, the button will slip out of it. Then I continue knitting to the end of the sample. I worked for rows with short rows to create the buttonhole. Then I joined these 2 halves into one single fabric. At the beginning, make 2 yarn overs. Next, knit the 7 placket stitches that were left unworked. Now, I will work these stitches up to the marker using short rows. I turn the work at the point marked with the stitch marker. But I still have 2 yarn overs here that also need to be worked together with the stitches. The stitch goes over the yarn over. And this is how I continue knitting the placket stitches. I reach the yarn over. I turn this stitch and knit it together with the yarn over. Then, I turn the work again. I slip this stitch unworked. I still have 1 yarn over left here. Once again, I knit to the end. I turn the work again. And again I knit all the placket stitches. The last one, together with the yarn over. To avoid holes forming here, you can also knit 1 more stitch together with the yarn over. After that, I remove the marker, as I no longer need it here. I remove it, because from this point on, I will continue knitting in the usual way. As you can see, a neat buttonhole has formed. So this is the first buttonhole, and the first button. Next, there will be a second, a third, and as many as the length of the placket allows. This is the sample I ended up with. It looks like a small cuff. This placket method can be used for different garment details. It all depends on the designer, imagination. Now, I'll show you how neat it looks when it's unbuttoned and when it's buttoned. Even on the wrong side, it looks very clean and tidy. On this pleasant note, I'll finish the first part of the placket tutorial. Subscribe so you don't miss something interesting for you in the second part.